Okay, hello everybody. Second IELTS lesson for me, so very excited to welcome you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brendan and I'm the owner of Total IELTS, and we offer online IELTS preparation. So if you have any questions about this particular lesson, that's fantastic. Please enter a comment below this video, or if there's any other further questions, feel free to check out our website, totalielts.com. So today's lesson is all about the speaking test. So it's we're going to look at lexical resource. Now this is one of the 4 sections of the marking criteria that your speaking examiner will use. Okay, so let's get started with today's lesson. Okay, so you probably know by now, or at least you should know, that there are 4 marking criteria used by your examiner for the speaking test, and they are lexical resource, fluency and coherence, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. Now, do not worry if that all sounds odd or strange to you. We're going to do a series of videos over the next number of weeks on each of these. But today we're going to focus on lexical resource. I'm going to do it in detail. So please like this lesson and post your questions. I'll try my very best to answer them. So as we know, the speaking section is it is the shortest section of the IELTS exam. It lasts between 11 and 14 minutes. And I know that for some people it feels a lot longer, because if you can think about it, you're getting asked somewhere between 16 to 20 questions. So that's over 1 question a minute. So unless you haven't practiced a sample IELTS speaking test with somebody, you might find it, I won't say intimidating, but a little bit intense. You need to focus and be on your game on the day. You need to be sharp. For example, if you're not relaxed, I just learned this myself from my last Facebook Live video, which happened to be my first one. If you're not focused on what you're saying in the speaking test, you're going to say something that doesn't make sense, and you will probably it's hard to remember what you've studied when you're under pressure. So it's very important to try your best to remain calm during your IELTS speaking test, okay? And that comes with a lot of practice. So back to lexical resource. The objective for today is to introduce you to the concept of lexical resource, which, as I said, is one of the 4 marking criteria. Now, lexical resource is really just a fancy name for vocabulary. Okay, 25% of your speaking test is vocabulary, and actually it also transfers into writing as well, where it's 25%. But if you think about it, for the listening and reading sections, of course you're going to need a lot of vocabulary as well there. So vocabulary is a huge part of the IELTS test for both versions. Now, before we go any further, I want to show you the marking criteria. Okay, so this is the marking criteria. It's a simplified version of what your examiner is going to use on the day of the speaking test. So basically you'll see at band 5. Now this is only for a lexical resource. As I said, there are 3 other marking criteria that we will cover over the next number of lessons. Okay, so at band 5 you'll see that there's limited flexibility with the vocabulary that's used. So for example, you're using words like good and bad, and you tend to repeat them a lot. Now, good and bad, although they make sense and they describe something, of course, they're not giving us the detail that something like selfish or mean or polite would give if you were describing a person. Okay, so everything can be good or bad. Now, that's just an example. So if you're at band 5, you're able to talk about familiar topics, but you're only able to convey that basic meaning. Okay, when you're talking about unfamiliar or more difficult topics. So you're okay talking about more personal things rather than more complex topics, I guess. You rarely attempt to paraphrase at band 5. Again, we're going to look at what we mean by paraphrasing. You use simple vocabulary, I just touched on that, and you've insufficient vocabulary. So band 5 is, it allows for mistakes, certainly, but I'm guessing that a lot of you will want to be hitting band 6, 7, well, at least 6 or 7. I think a lot of people need 7, to be honest. At band 6, you have enough vocabulary to talk about most topics. But again, there are some errors. So even at band 6, you are allowed a certain amount of errors, but of course, it still needs to make a lot of sense what you're saying. And inappropriacies. Now, what is meant by inappropriacies? For example, you're using words in the wrong context. So one that I've heard is too much excited. Okay, yes, too much is a lot, but too much is usually a problem. It's actually too much to the point where it's a negative feeling. So too much excited is like, how can you be too much excited? You're very excited. Okay, so that's like an inappropriacy. You're using vocabulary in the wrong context or with the wrong noun or verb. Okay, at band 7 you're using idioms and collocations properly. Okay, you're also matching the better criteria in band 6 and 5 as well, but at band 7 you're using idiomatic expressions and collocations. Now this is something we're definitely going to look at in this lesson. Okay, and band 8, very few mistakes and using less common words. Again, that's something that we will look at in due course. So what do we need to score high in Lexical Resource? Well, basically we can narrow it down to 2 things. Okay, let me see if I can get myself on this camera actually. Yeah, there I am. Okay, so if we simplify it, all that marking criteria, which can be confusing, even though that one was a simplified version of it, it's still quite difficult to distinguish between the scores if you're not very familiar with IELTS. But the 2 things is you need to know a lot or a range of vocabulary. Okay, like I said, you don't want to be describing a holiday as being good or bad, or describing the food that you had as that it made you happy or sad. Now, it's okay now and again, but you want to be giving a range of vocabulary, different ways to express yourself. Okay, you're not depending on the same vocabulary all the time, and this is why you need to know a lot of words that have the same meaning. Okay, and that's something we're going to look at again later. They're called synonyms. Okay, and the second thing, I know it might sound obvious, is that you know how to use the vocabulary properly. Now, this is why I don't recommend students learning vocabulary from lists, because although it's nice to have a list in front of you from your IELTS tutor and you learn 5 words a day and there's a great feeling and you can tick them off and you can spell them. It's using them properly is the most important thing, because remember, this is all about communicating your message. You want to be able to use the word correctly within a sentence, and as you may know, certain words change depending on the words around them. So, you know, there's a lot of things that can influence it. So that's why word lists are not something I recommend to broaden your range of vocabulary. So, what does our examiner want to hear during the speaking test? Now, you'll see in the slide that I have 2 elements that are important. Now, in total there are 4, but I'm going to use synonyms and paraphrasing together, okay? Because there's a slight overlap. Now, synonyms are words, like I said earlier, words that are different but have the same meanings. Now, the thing is, if an examiner asks you a question and you repeat the vocabulary used in that question, that doesn't show a broad range, of vocabulary. So that's why synonyms are very important. Like synonyms, paraphrasing is using different language to express the same thing. But this time you're changing the structure of the sentence. Okay? So, if you were asked about something like climate change and you kept repeating weather, you need to be able to have various different terms and vocabulary for weather, because it's going to be something that you're going to need to say in a number of ways. You're going to bring it into a lot of your arguments, okay? And also you need a range of vocabulary, so you need to be able to say things like fossil fuels or solar panels, because these are topic-specific words and they are specific to the topic of climate change, okay? So that's why we need to move beyond the good, bad, happy, sad. We need more detailed vocabulary so that the examiner knows exactly what you're talking about. Let's have a look at what I mean by that. Okay. Let's say the examiner is asking you, what is the weather like in your country? Okay, and you can answer, the weather isn't nice, which is fine. It makes sense. Short answer, but we're not focusing on it being a short answer today. We're just looking at vocabulary, lexical resource. Okay. Now, you could also swap the word nice using a synonym and say that the weather isn't pleasant. Okay. So instead of nice, you're using the word pleasant. Again, you have repeated weather here again, but that's okay. At least you're making an effort and you're proving to the examiner that you have more than one word to describe the weather, which is something to show off, I guess. Then we could say the weather is dreary. Okay, so dreary is another is a synonym for isn't nice. Okay, now you'll notice as well with this one, the weather is dreary. Now the first 2 are negative and the third one is in the affirmative. It's a positive sentence. And the third example, the weather is dreary, is using paraphrasing because you've changed the structure of the sentence. You've changed it from isn't to is. And you've also used a different word, dreary. Okay? So already we have 3 ways of saying the same thing. And the last one, it's miserable. Okay? So you didn't repeat weather. You just said it's miserable. So instead of isn't nice or isn't pleasant or dreary, you've used a synonym, miserable. So if you can picture it, if you're talking about the weather, you have 4 ways to describe it. I mean, if you're giving a long answer, generally, now we don't encourage you to repeat the same thing over and over again, but you're going to be touching on the fact that if you have bad weather in your country, you're going to need a range of vocabulary to express that. So that's paraphrasing and using synonyms. So basically, all of these sentences mean the same thing. Okay, now we're going to listen to 2 sample answers from Laura. Now, I recorded this earlier today. I hope you find it useful. The question asks her, what do you like to do on the weekends? And I want you to think about why question 2 is a better answer, given that we know that synonyms and paraphrasing is very important. Okay? So again, this is a recorded, and hopefully it will work for me. This is a recorded answer from earlier today. Fingers crossed.
On the weekend, well, I like to spend time with my family and friends. On Saturdays, I usually go to the cinema with my girlfriends. And then on Sundays, I like to hang out with my nephew. He's 15 and he loves playing board games.
So, as you can see, or as you've heard, Laura has given 2 different answers. And not only was answer 2 a lot longer, which is more impressive, but not necessarily for a lexical resource, she doesn't repeat the words in the question. Okay, what do you like to do on weekends? Instead of repeating weekend, which she did in answer 1, she used Saturday and Sunday. Now that's just a very simple example, but still just as effective. Okay, and instead of love, she said enjoy. Okay, so this is very impressive. She said, I usually go to the cinema. So she used an adverb of frequency. I usually go. And on Sunday, I enjoy spending the day chilling out. Okay, which is quite an impressive idiomatic expression, which we're going to talk about later on. Okay, with my nephew. Again, this is quite, we can't say it's a good word, but it's a specific word, and you would need to have a certain amount of English to say something like that. I mean, a lot of people would know brother or sister, but nephew, that's shows an understanding of vocabulary, so that's good. Okay, now she went on to talk about her brother, her nephew being 15, and that he likes board games. Now, I guess the reason she did that was she wanted to expand her answer, and it worked perfectly. She got to use more vocabulary, and it followed on nicely from what she said earlier. Okay, because he was already mentioned, so she developed that answer. Okay, so that means that the examiner was able to understand what exactly is happening. So there was a nice flow to her answer. Okay, so no matter what question you're given, it's always useful to begin your response by paraphrasing the question that was given to you. Okay, now we don't want to restate it word for word. This is what it's all about. Lexical resource is about being able to use synonyms and being able to paraphrase. So you need more than one way to express an idea. Okay. So what else does the examiner want to hear? Collocations. Okay, now the reason collocations are important is, again, it shows a range of vocabulary. Okay, now if you can see from these phrases, some of them will sound a lot more natural than others. Let's see if you can identify them. In total, so we have make a phone call, a completely intelligent student, a delicious painting, ordering a cup of coffee, a packed bus, miserable weather, and a fat tree. Now, I may have said some that are not on that slide. Apologies if I did. But as you can see, collocations are about groups of words working together. Okay, so the more collocations you use, the more you sound like a native speaker. So you may remember from earlier in the lesson, I didn't support the idea of learning lists of vocabulary. And this is one of the reasons, because collocations are all about words, word families, I guess. So instead of learning individual words, you learn the word that comes after it. Okay? So from this slide, I guess, you can see that a completely intelligent student, that does not sound right. You cannot be completely intelligent. You can be an intelligent student, certainly, but we don't say a completely. They just don't work together. Now, there's no rules with collocations. These are just things that you have to pick up from listening and learning everyday English, okay? A delicious painting sounds a bit odd. How can a painting be delicious? You don't eat it. Okay, you describe food as being delicious. That's another example of an incorrect collocation. The other one is a fat tree. Now, of course, the examiner knows what you're trying to say, but the language you're using is incorrect, and it stands out. Okay, on the marking criteria from earlier, you may have seen that to score band 7, you need to have some awareness of style and collocation. So if you are trying to get a band score of 7, which I think a lot of you would be, you need to be familiar with how collocations work. Okay, yes, and the last one that is very important. Remember, we're talking about lexical resource today. So we've already done synonyms, paraphrasing, and collocations, and the last one are idiomatic expressions. Now, these guys can really boost your speaking score, particularly if you're aiming for the 7, 8 or 9. But like all vocabulary, they need to be used properly and correctly and in the correct context. There is nothing worse. Can you hear those cats? Okay, so there's cats just outside the door having a fight. Scary, scary. Right. So they have to be used properly, basically. If you're going to use an idiomatic expression incorrectly, it really does jump out, and the examiner isn't going to be too impressed. If you don't know how to use them properly, leave them out. Okay? Trust me on that one. So, what is an idiom? It's something you can't understand if you take it word for word. Okay? For example, let's say you're telling your mom that you're going to buy an iPhone. Okay, and as we know, iPhones are quite expensive, right? And your mom goes, that will cost you an arm and a leg. Now, if we take that literally, it will cost you an arm and a leg. Okay, obviously, we're not going to give the Apple Store or arm or a leg, but what we're trying to say is, obviously, that it's so expensive that it's almost worth a part of your body. Okay, so they're kind of fun things to learn. They shouldn't be overused. They should definitely be used now and again if you want to score high, but again, please use them in the right context. That's very important. But there's simpler versions of idiomatic expressions as well, like look up something. To look up something doesn't mean you're actually looking up at the sky. It just means that you're looking up a word in a dictionary, or you're looking up a name in your phone book. So these are different idiomatic expressions that you can use. Okay? So like collocations, they're best used through reading or listening in a given context. So, here are 3 common idiomatic expressions or idioms that I recorded again earlier today, and Laura is going to give them to me. Just give me 1 second and I will see if I can get that going for you.
Oh, where do I start? So many things can be done. Unfortunately, the government's been talking about fixing this major problem for years now, but actions speak louder than words. Sure, it can be really challenging. This summer is the first in 6 years that I haven't been able to travel because I failed 2 exams last term. Unfortunately, it's back to the drawing board. Oh, piece of cake. My dad's a teacher too, and he's home from work before me. That along with the 3 months off in the summer.
3 useful idioms that Laura used in the right context. Now you're not going to use them one after another in the same way Laura did. These are just examples, okay? So you get to learn them within the context. I do recommend learning a number of them, but I wouldn't get obsessed with them at the same time, okay? It's better to use the more common ones than try to use a less known one in an incorrect context. Excuse me, if that makes sense. Now, remember, today's lesson is all about lexical resource for the speaking test, okay? My next lesson is going to be on fluency and coherence. And then after that, we're going to go through the other ones, the grammar and the pronunciation. Okay, so this is just lesson 1 of a 4-lesson series, if that's what you would like to call it.